Hello, welcome to Summerfest Online 2020. Thank you very much for coming along to view these presentations. Just a quick reminder that we have a number of exhibitors in the exhibitors hall. If you want to go along and have a quick browse, maybe do some shopping, then we'd love to see you. And a quick reminder too about our wonderful sponsors, Yayo Hemp Products and Butte Island Cheese. They're also in the exhibitors hall and they'd love to see you too. If you've enjoyed the show, please remember this is a free event, and if you'd like to make a small donation, you'd be very welcome. Please go to the Friends of VegFest page to make a donation. And a reminder too, we have another show in November, London Online, and in next March, Plant Powered Expo. And you can find out all about that on VegfestUK. Thanks very much and enjoy the presentation.
Welcome to the Animal Rights Show Tribute Edition.
Yay.
And we each picked out a highlight clip that we think represents the show well. And really, I know what this show has brought me is just helped bring the community together. I mean, I think in these strange times we live in, it can be quite easy to feel a bit detached and isolated from things, not being able to attend those usual events and social gatherings. And yeah, getting together for these Zoom calls has been a great way to pull us together. And I think there's also a lot of really complicated topics that I know I'm keen to explore more myself, and I think others are too, which is really what the show's done for me. For my clip, we were talking about probably one of my favorite subjects, which is language. And this was towards the end of a really robust discussion. And we've been using question prompts to help pull the conversation back to some key themes to make sure, things stay on topic. And we were reluctant and had some internal dialogue as a team whether or not to include this prompt. And in the end, I'm glad we did, because I think it was my favorite contribution of the day. And it's from someone who actually became a later team member of ours, Sarah, and really highlighted to me a key thing that I think doesn't get enough attention, and that's ableism awareness. And the part of this clip that really stood out to me is that our language should never deny someone their existence, be it human or one of our fellow animals. And it really highlights that commonality between human and other animal oppression, but also I know for me, trying to learn more about being respectful in my language, both for other animals as well as humans, it helped me to be more mindful to do just that. So with that, I'll let the clip speak for itself.
Yeah, on the topic of these terms, in a lot of the reasons why people would give, they'd say, oh, they don't mean anything by saying these terms. And I think it does really come down to understanding that people really often don't understand why the word is hurtful as opposed to offensive. Similar to what Roger was saying, like a lot of people think people are just getting offended by things, but the hurt is very, very real. And it's like with ableism, the world doesn't really allow people with different abilities a space in existence as it is. They're always, denied their reality. So then when they go out and they hear people, using these words jokingly at their friends, like saying, oh, you're an idiot, or in Ireland, it's really like words like spastic and handicapped are so used just regularly. So I had a brother who grew up hearing people, he's disabled, and he grew up hearing people using these terms. And he was like, why is my existence an insult? Because, those words are meant to mean just, to define their abilities, but they're being used as insults. So he grew up with an understanding that his very existence was used as an insult. So, what it creates in later life is like a complete misunderstanding of where you belong in the world, which people with disabilities already can have, because there's very little, space for them as it is. So I think it's really important. But even me growing up with two family members who have extreme disabilities, I even use ableist language. It's like so ingrained in everything, and you really, really have to work on like checking yourself and making sure that the words you're using aren't literally denying someone's, existence in the world. So yeah.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because that was just part of the show that was completely spontaneous, and it left everybody going, wow, You know, that's one of the things that these shows do. You know, which is a great thing. You never know what's going to happen, and that was one of the most powerful things that we all remember.
So one of my favorite clips from the show, I think this was one of the first shows that we did, if not the first. So in the clip you're about to see, we have Roger, who is talking about the movement's messaging and the lack of clarity in that messaging. So what you'll see in the clip is Roger claiming that the animal rights movement does not advocate for the rights of animals. And at first, this is quite striking. But when we consider the typical messaging that is projected from the movement, largely welfare focused, that striking claim starts to make sense. Roger goes on to highlight how certain groups are, who are certainly not for advocating for the rights of animals, yet they are perceived by the popular mind as an animal rights group. And I think a distinction between rights and welfare is really important to make. And this clip stands out to me in starting to clarify that distinction. So here it is.
I don't really agree that we can talk about the existing movement as the animal rights movement, because it's not. It's like saying PETA is an animal rights organization, which a lot of people would say, but that's not true. So it would be important to not kind of, this is a non-specialist term, no, we shouldn't over egg that. You know, we should be more honest about it. So in terms of the idea of animal rights broadly defined, you know, which some people use, I would tend to say, if I'm talking about the whole movement, I tend to talk about the animal advocacy movement. You know, so Francione would then say, well, in that case, we've got the animal confusion movement, because it's utterly confused in terms of its philosophical grounding. And to include everything that goes on in the movement, from the RSPCA along to wherever, as the animal rights movement, is just wrong.
Groovy.
That's really the whole idea behind the show, isn't it? Kind of re-inject rights back into the animal movement.
There you go.
Well, before I start, I want to refute Brad's suggestion just now that I made sense at any given time. But my clip involves someone who's been involved with the movement since 1972, been a vegan since 1972, and seen a lot of changes over the time. And we were trying to talk about something that comes up in social movement theory, which is that when a movement becomes more and more mainstream, there is a threat to the core values of the movement. Now, this is something that causes a bit of kind of, it's interesting really, because obviously every movement wants to become mainstream, or at least grow and, you know, become a kind of mass movement. At the same time, this is the very thing that might actually threaten some of the core values. So that's the kind of core idea to what Ronnie Lee says here.
Yeah, I think that's like a kind of, I mean, Roger probably agree with me, it's like a kind of sort of sociological reason why there's been this change in the vegan movement, where a lot of people are apolitical. A lot of people are kind of identifying themselves as right wing, for instance, now, or I wouldn't, not the majority, but perhaps a substantial minority. In the early days, you know, when the kind of animal rights movement started kind of getting going in this country in the 1970s into the 80s, it was really difficult to live as a vegan. It was almost impossible to eat out. It was not easy to get vegan products, and so people that became vegan tended to be already radical people that kind of weren't worried about being kind of part of society, weren't worried about being kind of normal people, so to speak. So a lot of other ideas kind of went with veganism. For instance, anarchism, like lots of vegans were anarchists in those days. You know, it tended to be like a very, very left-wing movement in its thinking because of that, because people were unconventional, didn't want to be conventional. But I think now, because it's kind of it's so easy now to live as a vegan, that people that aren't so radical in other ways, don't set themselves apart from society in other ways, kind of have become vegan, at least in terms of consuming a vegan diet. And I think that may be one of the reasons why we've seen this kind of change in politics in the movement.
So what do you think, Roger? Do you think the movement becoming more mainstream is a risk?
Well, that's what social movement theory says, actually, Jeremy. But because it's not. I mean, we're not just talking about our movement. We talk about social movements in general, you know, and they do kind of de-radicalize, they moderate, they professionalize, all those things. Some people might say are inevitable, you know, in the linear growth of a movement, but every step of the way, that's a threat to the core values. And we are seeing that a little bit in the vegan movement, which is an interest of mine, and it's something we've talked about in the show as well. So yeah, it is always a threat, but it's almost like an inevitable development at the same time.
Yeah, and our movement being particularly unique, isn't it? Because the ones we're truly advocating on behalf of and solidarity with aren't necessarily part of the core movement.
Well, they can't tell us that we're getting it wrong, can they? That's the interesting thing. They can't say, you know, you're advocating for me wrongly. They can't do that. Yeah, that's interesting. That.
Best we can amplify their voices, the better.
Roger, do you think on the topic of de-radicalization, do you think that's we see that in effect with the national groups when it comes to their donor pools, weakening the message in order to widen their donor pools and things like that?
It's a kind of pressure on national groups. You know, when they professionalized, they ended up getting a lot of people with wages, and therefore then they've got to be careful that they can sustain themselves. And so that then means that their donor base might need to be quite wide. And in terms of the vegan movement, there might not be enough vegans to sustain a large amount of staff. So that tension is kind of built into this particular movement.
It reminds me of when you get rock bands or cult bands, and they're very kind of, you know, they have certain values and a certain edge to them, and then as soon as they get popular, they go mainstream and they lose it, and all the original fans absolutely hate them.
So you're saying we're basically a rock band.
Yeah.
Well, I've chosen a couple of clips actually. So the first one I chose is from one of our earlier episodes in the series, in which Roger is talking about the focus and scope of the animal rights movement. And
so you picked on me again, Tom.
I picked on you again. But I found this particular kind of explanation, Roger, really helpful in terms of understanding where our movement sits amongst other social justice movements, and that our focus is always going to be on advocating for the rights of animals. But as part of that, we are part of a wider social justice movement, and the scope is always showing solidarity and respect for other humans as well, and other human rights activists who are doing similar work in our space. And I do feel personally that it's important for us to show solidarity with those groups and work with them. And yeah, so I take kind of heart from that, knowing that we're part of this bigger kind of collective group of individuals who are on the same path.
I think the people who often claim that, you know, the other animals need their own movement, and they need a movement to concentrate on their well-being and in our terms the respect for their rights. They kind of create a problem, I think, which is not really there, in the sense that if you look at the history of the vegan society, you could understand it, especially with the work of Leslie Cross. You could understand it in terms of focus and scope. So it is true that the vegan social movement have always been focused on human relations with other animals, but that's never been the scope of it. And so it seems to me that some of the things that some of maybe the newer activists complain about is a problem that they've almost like manufactured. It's not really there, and it never has been. But, you know, from my point of view, it's always been intertwined or entangled in David Nybert's sense. So, you know, the activists that I've always known have been interested and engaged in both issues all the time. And it's just been seen as a kind of natural thing. which is something that Reagan emphasizes over and over again in his work.
Well, it has the potential of addressing a pretty big internal dialogue within the movement right now, doesn't it? Because I think a lot of people think it's a threat when really, if we acknowledge, I think a lot of people, want to keep the focus. Well, I think pretty much everyone wants to keep the focus on other animals. It's just at a minimum being respectful of human issues. That's really all it takes.
It's bizarre though, isn't it? Because what's being perceived as a weakness and a threat is actually a strength.
And it's always been there. There's been some new terminology that's brought into the movement, but that idea has always been there.
I must say, as someone who, in my earlier days in the movement, did see intersectionality as a negative, the idea of focus and scope cleared it up for me, and really makes it quite simple, to be honest. Simple to understand.
Yeah, I agree that the focus and scope has really helped me to get that clear as well. And I feel a lot of the resistance in the movement too, and I don't even feel, and I know we've chatted about this as well, that intersectionality might even be the wrong term for what we talk about. And we think more about maybe David Nybert's entanglements, because it's intertwined and interwoven rather than just a cross section. And I think the resistance to that kind of looking at human issues as well as other animal issues is because people think it's going to take away the focus on other animals. And so I think it's often a misunderstanding of that. And so I think Roger's clarification of the focus and scope has really helped me get that very clear in my own mind as well. And it helps me to explain it to other people as well. So that's been very, very useful. Thanks, Roger.
Looks like you might have come up with something useful, Roger.
Yeah, well, I was just waiting around for somebody to find it useful.
So for my second clip, I've really enjoyed the numerous conversations we've had around language, which Jeremy's touched on, and the kind of exploration of the impact and the linguistic tools that our language has, and the weight that carries, and what that means for certain people. And I know the word is ethnomodology, I believe, how people receive certain words that we say. And the one thing that I would encourage all people watching these clips is, please, if you can, check yourself when you're referring to other animals as it. It's one little thing that we can do, and referring to animals as he or she, they, just gives so much more power and weight to our advocacy, and revering them as individuals. But this clip that I want to show is just I think it was early on in one of our episodes in which we were exploring the different words, use and exploitation, and I really enjoyed Brad's take on the kind of power that using the word exploitation may have, as opposed to using the word use, and how we casually in society as humans use various objects, but when we exploit other beings, it can mean so much more. And I think Brad really encapsulates that. And I kind of found it funny how he finished it on the end as well, but I'll leave that for you to enjoy.
So obviously society views animals as objects wrongly, and its and some things. You can use objects, so you can use a car, you can use a chair, but you can't exploit objects. You can't exploit a car, you can't exploit tables and chairs, but you can exploit other animals. So to me, that kind of is a point in favor of animal exploitation over use. I definitely agree that they're both better than suffering, abuse, torture, cruelty, because they're very subjective and imply welfare. And but I am in camp exploitation. I mean, I don't think anyone's ever enjoyed my take before, so thank you, Tom.
Yeah, the end bit is funny because Brad declares himself to be in the exploitation camp.
I could have worded it better. Yeah.
So the clip I've chosen was taken from the show that ran the day after animal rights activist Regan Russell was run over and killed by a truck outside of Fearman's Pork slaughterhouse in Burlington, in Canada. She was there to peacefully protest and bear witness to the pigs that were being brought there to be killed. So this affected me very much, and let me give you a little context on why. The day before Regan was killed, I had been at a protest myself in Ramsgate against the live export of our fellow animals. And during the protest, it was made very clear to activists to be really careful when the trucks came, because they weren't guaranteed to stop if you got in their way. And it got me thinking about Jill Phipps, another activist who was killed by a truck on a similar protest at an airport in Coventry in February 1995. And Jill was literally on my mind all day. And I was imagining how it would be if one of my friends who were here with me at this protest were to get killed and I were to witness that. And it was a very emotional day anyway, as these things are, and especially when the trucks showed up and, you know, you see all the individuals on the trucks, and the reality of why you're there hits you hard. And I was very mindful of the trucks, but did come close to being run over by a car that had no intentions of slowing down at a roundabout, as did another activist. So when the news of Regan's death came the next day, it just really hit me. I felt somehow connected to that because of everything that I'd been thinking about the day before and everything that had happened. And I didn't know Regan personally, but I did attend an event in her memory and learned a lot about her. And she was a very committed activist who dedicated her time to advocating for justice for other animals. But she also got involved in other movements fighting injustice, such as Black Lives Matter. And one thing that someone who knew her well said about her was that whenever she was at an event, she was always the person who would welcome new activists and be so friendly to everyone. So she was warm and compassionate and full of empathy for others, whatever their species. And I feel like she is a real loss to our movement. And we all felt on the Animal Rights Show, we felt really strongly that we should stand in solidarity with Regan. And so we decided to hold a minute's silence for her on the show the next day. And the clip is of Seb Alex giving a beautiful introduction and a tribute to Regan and an introduction to the silence. I found it very moving and very powerful.
For those of you who don't know, just a quick summary of what happened yesterday. An activist in Canada was killed during a vigil outside a slaughterhouse. Her name was Regan Russell. She was 65 years old. She's been active in animal rights since 1977. She was arrested 11 times for acts of civil disobedience to help animals. She was at marine land protests. She stood up for sled dogs, recently trespassing to expose their exploitation. She protested on behalf of sexual assault victims against Bill Cosby when he was speaking in Hamilton. She attended the Black Lives Matter protest in Hamilton very recently, and she went to vigils every single Sunday. Unfortunately, we lost her yesterday, and this is not the first time that this happens. We also have had similar things in the past with Jill Phipps, 31 years old. She was killed while protesting against live exports in the UK in front of her mother. Police was there as well. Truck driver was never held guilty for what happened. Tom Warby, who was 15 years old, Hunsab, was killed by a hunter, and Mike Hill as well. That being said, we're going to take a 1 minute long silence in memory of Regan Russell. Thank you.